Nintendo's decision to utilize cartridges for the Nintendo 64 instead of CD-ROMs was puzzling for a lot of third-party companies. With PlayStation and Sega moving into the CD-ROM era, Nintendo seemed a little bit behind. Now, yes, there were benefits to cartridges such as no loading times, but it seemed like the benefits of CD-ROM further outweighed what a cartridge could do. You had more room for video streaming, for full motion video, for CD quality audio, and discs were cheap to make. You could make a 3 or 4 disc game if you really needed to, and it would still be cheaper than manufacturing just one cartridge. Now, because of this, a lot of third-party companies did end up shying away from the Nintendo 64, and it really benefited the PlayStation brand. Konami, Squaresoft, and Capcom were powerhouses on the Super Nintendo, but not really seen very much on the N64 compared to the PlayStation 1. Of course, PlayStation had all sorts of new franchises as well that were absolutely lighting the gaming scene on fire, one of them being Capcom's Resident Evil. Resident Evil, of course, took upon the principles of Alone in the Dark and really expanded upon it, put it into a more modern era, and for many people is the godfather of the survival horror genre. Nintendo 64 fans were on the outside looking in at the amazing Resident Evil franchise until something strange happened. Resident Evil 2, the multi-disc sequel to the original Resident Evil, was announced for the Nintendo 64. How could this be? This game was 2 discs on the PlayStation 1, and we all know the size limitations of the Nintendo 64 cartridge. This game really should not exist, but it does. And you know what? It's spectacular. Capcom decided to go with a company called Angel Studios to handle the port of Resident Evil 2 to the Nintendo 64. Now, Angel Studios is better known today as Rockstar San Diego, but at the time they had done a few Nintendo 64 titles. Major League Baseball featuring Ken Griffey Jr. and the sequel to the game. Obviously, though, this was a much bigger undertaking than a baseball game, bringing over a 2-disc PlayStation 1 game that featured quite a bit of full-motion video and CD quality audio. The PlayStation 1 and the Nintendo 64 had very different architectures. The PlayStation, of course, used these CD-ROMs, each offering up to 650 megabytes of storage per disc. It also had robust full-motion video playback and supported high-quality audio. The Nintendo 64, however, relied on cartridges, with a maximum capacity of just 64 megabytes. Now, while the N64's custom processor did allow for advanced 3D rendering and lighting, the lack of space and expensive cartridges definitely posed quite a few challenges. Now, Resident Evil 2 on the PlayStation was around 1.2 gigabytes of data, but oddly enough, it didn't necessarily have to be that way. You see, Resident Evil 2 on the PlayStation 1 was actually the victim of some miscalculations. The game's audio actually wouldn't take up as much space as it was initially thought it was going to be based on these miscalculations, but by the time this was discovered, Capcom had a decision to make: either rework everything and put it on 1 disc, or continue with the 2-disc format that they were already using. Of course, they decided to continue with the 2-disc format. But how was Angel Studios going to take 1.2 gigabytes and turn it into 64 megabytes on the Nintendo 64? Well, that's where compression came into play. The PlayStation version used uncompressed FMVs, but these could not be fit on a Nintendo 64 cartridge. FMVs were then recoded using advanced compression techniques by factor 5, which significantly reduced their size at the cost of some visual quality. On the audio side of things, the PlayStation version was in high-quality stereo sound. For the Nintendo 64 version, music and dialogue were compressed and output into mono to save space. So yes, the fidelity of the audio was reduced, but the team worked to maintain the clarity of the essential sounds of the game. Utilizing these different techniques, it really allowed Angel Studios some wiggle room with putting this game onto the Nintendo 64's cartridge. And yes, there is a stark difference between watching the FMV scenes on the PlayStation 1 versus on the Nintendo 64, but the fact that they weren't cut out completely is honestly a miracle. Other games on the platform, such as Command and Conquer, had the full motion videos completely removed from the game, whereas this game remained to keep them intact. Now, you would think that the graphics would also suffer in the Nintendo 64 version of the game because of this compression. And in some areas it did, but in some areas it actually excelled beyond the PlayStation 1 version of the game. The PlayStation version of the game featured a native resolution of 320 by 240, and of course used high-quality pre-rendered backgrounds with sharp textures and detailed models. The Nintendo 64 version of the game also runs at a native resolution of 320 by 240, but there was a little trick up its sleeve with the Nintendo 64 expansion pack. The Nintendo 64 expansion pack actually allowed for higher resolution models, up to 480 interlaced models, which the PlayStation version of the game did not have. Now, the pre-rendered backgrounds for the Nintendo 64 version of the game were indeed scaled down and compressed, which makes them look a little bit softer compared to the sharpness of the PlayStation 1 version. However, the Nintendo 64's texturing filter helped smooth out some of the rough edges, giving the visuals a bit of a cleaner look compared to the PlayStation version. And the Nintendo 64 version actually introduced dynamic lighting effects absent in the PlayStation version. Going back to the resolution changes, this was actually something very interesting, because when actually playing the game with the expansion pack in on your Nintendo 64, you could see when the resolution goes from 480i to 240p, as things will get a little bit muddier. Now, what was the reasoning behind that sort of thing? Well, Modern Vintage Gamer made a video a couple of years ago talking about the Resident Evil 2 Nintendo 64 port, and on that, one of the developers for the game actually commented on how the resolution was decided. The resolution was based on a number of enemies currently in the room. Kill them, leave the room, and come back, and it will recalculate higher. The backgrounds were a fixed size, turning each to remove as many artifacts in the space given. The background resolution obviously can't change, just upscaled into a larger frame buffer, but will look pretty much the same, but the 3D elements could be drawn to look better. And honestly, at some points of the game, especially if you have an HDMI modded Nintendo 64, that 480i looks absolutely stunning, especially on the character models. This really makes this version of the game stand out, but unfortunately, there is a slight downside to this. If you're playing this on your modern television and you have a scaler, it can be a little bit tricky when the resolution changes. Sometimes it won't work, sometimes the scaler will black out for a few seconds, and if you're in the middle of a game, that could kind of be a pain in the ass. Luckily for me, I'm on an HDMI modded N64, and it works fantastically. Now, you would think that Angel Studios would have to cut some content in order to fit the 1.2 gigabytes down to 64 megabytes, but that's actually not the case, and there are exclusive features to the N64 version that were not in the PlayStation version. One thing was adjustable controls. Players could actually customize different control schemes and almost get rid of the tank controls that were found within this series. Now, I'm a fan of the tank controls because, I don't know, they just feel a bit natural to me, but it's nice that this was actually the first Resident Evil to feature something like that, as far as allowing you to customize things. There were also alternative costumes that were only featured in the Nintendo 64 version of the game. You had an option to change the blood color from green to blue to red. There was even a randomizer mode that you could unlock within the game that would change where basic items would be located within the game. Yes, a randomizer on a Nintendo 64 game. It's just absolutely incredible how they managed to fit this game onto a single cartridge without sacrificing really much of anything. You still have both Leon and Claire's campaigns. You have the additional campaigns that you can unlock after you beat the game under certain parameters. All of the content is still there, and there's even additional content added into this game. And of course, what did we say at the start of this video? Nintendo did not want these loading times on the Nintendo 64, and Resident Evil 2 on the Nintendo 64 definitely did not have these crazy loading times that sometimes the PlayStation 1 version of the game had, thanks to that cartridge-based medium. All in all, Resident Evil 2 has no business being on the Nintendo 64. And honestly, it has no business being on the Nintendo 64 in such a great playable format. This is actually one of my favorite, if not my favorite versions of Resident Evil 2, because it's just so mystifying to me. Every time I start up this game on my Nintendo 64, I'm just absolutely blown away how well the system handles it and how well Angel Studios managed to recreate the experience and in some instances make it even better than the PlayStation 1 version of the game. Now, yes, you could play your Resident Evil 2 remakes and stuff like that nowadays, and those are great games as well. But this was from an era where developers really had to put their heart and passion into these projects if they wanted to make things work. Imagine getting a full Resident Evil experience at 64 megabytes in 2024 and beyond. It would never happen. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Give me your thoughts and feedback in the comments section down below, whether or not you've played this version of Resident Evil 2. And as always, I'll catch you guys on the next video. Later.